I recall when I was chairing the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, on which I had the pleasure of serving with Professor Glendon, I wrote a letter condemning the ruling of the court in Cologne, Germany, treating male infant circumcision as a form of child abuse and demanding that this be rectified. I thought that for once in my life I had done something that would not be controversial. I thought defending the right of Jews to practice their faith, including the central practice of male infant circumcision, would be something that, at least here in the United States, would not be controversial, that we could all agree that Germany, of all places, Germany, should not be creating a situation in which Jews could simply not live there. And yet I was shocked when the hate mail started coming through the email system. There is a lot of support, even here in the United States, for the idea that male infant circumcision, which is practiced by some Muslims as well as by Jews, is a form of child abuse and should be banned. And for people who believe that very passionately, the claim of the basic right of religious freedom of the Jewish community is simply not availing. The child is not seen as a Jewish baby, but rather as a tabula rasa, as what our former colleague on the President's Council on Bioethics, Michael Sandel, calls an unencumbered self who should choose for himself when he turns 18, I suppose, whether to be circumcised. There's a genuine, profound conflict of worldviews there, a profound difference in what philosophers call anthropology, and it I think is a matter of considerable concern. My next very pleasant task is to introduce my beloved former student, Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveichik, who is the director of the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University, and who's also rabbi at Congregation Sharith Israel in Manhattan, which is the oldest Jewish congregation in the United States. Rabbi Soloveichik graduated summa cum laude from Yeshiva and was ordained by Yeshiva's seminary. He received his doctorate in religion from Princeton University. He has lectured throughout the United States and in Europe and in Israel to both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences on topics relating to Jewish theology, bioethics, religious freedom, wartime ethics, and Jewish-Christian relations. His essays on these topics have appeared in the Wall Street Journal and in Commentary magazine, in First Things magazine, and in the Weekly Standard. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Meir Soloveichik.
I want to begin by thanking King's College and the Madison program for putting together this very important evening, and to personally express my gratitude to all my co-presenters, but especially to Professor Rabbi George, who I'm proud to call my Rebbe. I think I actually once referred to Rabbi as my Rebbe at a conference at which we spoke in the Vatican, thereby making him the first person to ever get a rabbinic ordination in the Vatican. But as my teacher and as my friend and guide, he has had a profound impact on my life. The Talmud describes a form of a student, if they are lucky, as a Talmid Chaver, which means both a student and a friend and colleague, and it's been my great privilege to be Professor George's Talmid Chaver. And thank you for everything, for being here this evening, Rabbi. Thank you. On April 11th, 1945, Buchenwald concentration camp was liberated by Patton's army. And as the American forces approached, many inmates in the camp, having longed for liberation, ran to the gates, and as they did so, the Nazis, in a final attempt at murdering the inmates, opened fire from the guard tower. One young boy, the youngest survivor of Buchenwald, was in the line of fire, and somebody suddenly jumped on top of him and shielded him until the shooting had stopped. This boy got up then, ran away from the person who had held him down, who had saved his life, and cowered behind a pile of corpses as the Americans entered the camp. One of those Americans was a chaplain in Patton's Third Army, a man by the name of Rabbi Herschel Schachter. As one article describes, there in the filthy barracks, men lay on raw wooden planks stacked from floor to ceiling. They stared at the rabbi in his unfamiliar military uniform with unmistakable fright. And then this very strange-looking person opened his mouth and spoke a language they knew, Yiddish. And he said, Shalom Aleichem Yidden, ihr sind frei. Hello, fellow Jews, you are free. And he ran from barracks to barracks, repeating these words. And as he passed one mound of corpses, Rabbi Schachter spied a flicker of movement. Drawing closer, he saw a small boy, life in the midst of death, hiding in terror behind the mound. For this boy, anyone in a uniform was evil. And so Rabbi Schachter picked the boy up and said in Yiddish, How old are you? Wie alt bist du, mein Kind? And he replied, What difference does it make? Said this boy, who was 7 years old. I'm older than you. And Rabbi Schachter said, What do you mean you're older than me? Smiling. And the boy replied, Because you cry and laugh like a child, and I haven't laughed in a long time. So which one of us is older? And Rabbi Schachter took the boy by the hand, made the rounds in the barracks, announcing again, Shalom Aleichem Yidden, you are free. 5 decades later, this young boy, whose name was Israel Meir Lau, youngest survivor of Buchenwald, became the chief rabbi of the state of Israel. Tonight, as we gather to ponder the state of a European society that has not learned the lessons of that time, I will use this story as a jumping-off point in order to reflect on the moment in which we find ourselves. First, despite the darkness that seems to be settling once again on Europe and its Jewry, we must marvel at the miracles of our age. Out of the ashes of the European Holocaust, an embodiment of Ezekiel's Valley of the Dry Bones, a people have built a country in the Middle East that is a beacon of democracy and a wonder of our age. Built over the past several decades, it is truly a miracle embodied by the fact that the youngest survivor of Buchenwald became a chief rabbi of a country, of his people, that did not exist when he was liberated. Thus, this miracle reflects the mysterious, miraculous endurance and indestructibility of the Jewish people. We are, as Tolstoy once described us, the nation which neither slaughter nor torture could exterminate, which neither fire nor sword of civilizations were able to erase from the face of the earth. But the best description of this phenomenon of the miraculous existence of the Jews comes from the Southern Catholic writer Walker Percy, who once reflected as follows, quote, Why does no one find it remarkable that in most world cities today there are Jews, but no one single Hittite, even though the Hittites had a great flourishing civilization, while the Jews nearby were a weak and obscure people? Said Percy, when one meets a Jew in New York or New Orleans or Paris or Melbourne, it is remarkable that no one considers the event remarkable. What are they doing here? But it is even more remarkable to wonder, said Percy, if there are Jews here, why are there not Hittites? Where are the Hittites? Show me, said Percy, show me one Hittite in New York City. So, given some of the people I've met in New York City, if they were Hittites, that would explain a lot. Truth is that a boy of Buchenwald could become the chief rabbi of a flourishing Jewish state is not something the world would have predicted in the midst of that horror in 1945, because the story of the Jews is never something that one would have predicted. But here, however, is something else that no one would have predicted, that some 70 years after Buchenwald's liberation, anti-Semitism haunts Europe still. It can be found in hatred that Jews experience from Islamic communities in Europe. It can be seen in limitations placed on ritual slaughter or attempted bans on circumcision, but it is embodied most of all in the delegitimation of the Jewish state's right to exist a delegitimization that takes place at the highest levels of European government, even as European leaders are perfectly happy to participate in memorials for the Holocaust. As Michel Gorfinkel put it, now today, busily building monuments and museums, Europe ostentatiously engages in celebrating and mourning its lost dead Jews of yesterday, whose murder it variously perpetrated, abetted, or with exceptions, found it could put up with. Meanwhile, he said, it encourages and underwrites the withering of Jewish life today. Once again, said Gorfinkel, Jews are accepted on condition that they separate themselves from their brethren in Israel and join the official European consensus in demonizing the Jewish state, that they learn to accommodate the reality that so many ethnic Europeans hate them and wish them ill, and that Islamists on European soil seek their extinction, and that in the interest of justifying their continued claim to European citizenship, they accept Europe's proscription of some of the most basic practices of their faith. To the dead Jews of yesterday, everything. To the living Jews of today, little and littler, end quote. So why has anti-Semitism been so intertwined in Europe's history? And why has it reasserted itself? Here, I would disagree with one prominent explanation given by wise people that I admire, which is that Jews were hated because they were different, and that anti-Semitism is thus just a hatred of difference. I do not agree. Anti-Semitism is not a hatred of difference, it is a hatred of Jews. Just to take a British example, as was cited by Rabbi Dallin, England's Labour Party highlights the ethnic and gender diversity of its members. It embodies the spectrum of human differences. What it does not embrace is Jews. As Howard Jacobson reported in the New York Times in October, at the recent Labour conference just concluded, there was no sign, there was every sign that the fringe is now moving ever closer to the center. In his words, there were calls for some Jewish groups to be excluded from the party. A paper was handed out supporting the claim by Ken Livingstone of collusion between German Jews and Nazis. A motion to question the truth of the Holocaust was proposed, end quote. And so, anti-Semitism is a hatred of Jews. It is woven into the warp and weft of European history, and we are witness to its reassertion in European society. But this time focused first and foremost on the state of Israel. And why is this? To my mind, the explanation actually lies in the very phenomenon that we were marveling at in the first part of my presentation. That the Jews, throughout their history, their miraculous endurance and their extraordinary impact beyond their numbers on the history of the world, embodied and embodies a people that was chosen, miraculous, or as Tolstoy added, the Jew is eternal and is an embodiment of eternity. For much of Europe, this was intolerable. For each country sought to replace Israel and declare itself God's own chosen nation. Each nation's quest for chosenness, for eternity, resulted in the idolization of the state and in terrible wars between each other, whether the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, or the World Wars of the 20th century, wars which tore Europe apart. Then, after the Second World War, Europe did an about-face and went in the other directional extreme, seeking to do away with national identity, and doing so precisely when Israel as a state came into being, coming into being to become the most remarkable country to come into existence in the 20th century. Thus, even as Europe saw as a prescription for the ideal John Lennon's famous song, Imagine, otherwise known as the worst song ever written. Imagine there's no countries and no religions too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. At the same time, Israel becomes not only a success of nationalism, but a miracle. Thus, as David Goldman once put it, in the past, each European nation that fancied itself God's instrument on earth set out to humiliate, expel, or even exterminate the Jews. For how could France or Spain or Russia or Germany be the chosen nation when the Jews claimed that status? But after 3 devastating wars lasting 2 generations each, the Europeans grew weary of their contentious national identities, and they agreed to become nothing in particular, to declare oneself a Jewish patriot, a Zionist, transgresses the boundaries of civilized discourse in today's Europe. And so old Europe hated the Jews because it envied its election. Today, all too often, new Europe hates the Jews because Europe eschews election altogether. Herein lies a painful irony. Zionism and some of its secular founders sought in statehood the normalization of the Jewish people, and thereby the end of anti-Semitism. In the end, it achieved anything but that. Israel is a flourishing modern democracy, but it is not normal. It is actually a reminder of the mystery of Jewish chosenness. As Paul Johnson put it, in the past century, over 100 completely new independent states have come into existence. Israel, said this non-Jewish historian, is the only one whose creation can fairly be called a miracle. Israel truly is a modern democratic marvel, but simultaneously an enduring reminder of the mystery that is the endurance of what in Hebrew is called the Am HaNivchar, the chosen nation. It is anything but normal. This is the story of its success, but this is precisely also why it is hated. Anti-Semitism in Europe, then, is not hatred of human difference, but of Jews, and ultimately of Jewish particularism and even Jewish chosenness. And this explanation, I think, allows us to answer another question. Why has America, throughout its history, so largely avoided the infection of anti-Semitism? To be sure, the United States has its own original sin in racism and slavery, and one cannot say that its history is utterly devoid of anti-Semitism. But still, the Jewish experience in America has been a blessed one. So what did America, whose cultural roots lies in Europe, what did America have that Europe lacked? Why was it part of the Western world and yet open to Jews and Judaism in a way unthinkable elsewhere? After all, nothing embodies the blessed Jewish experience in America and the blessing America has been to the Jews and the freedom with which Jews can bring their religion into the public square in America. Nothing better embodies that than an Orthodox rabbi wearing the uniform of the U.S. Armed Forces, entering Buchenwald wearing that uniform and saying in Yiddish, "Hello, my fellow Jews, you are free." So why America? The answer, I think, surely lies in America's relationship with the Hebrew Bible, how it impacted the founders, many of whom were entranced with, rather than envious of, the miraculous story of the Jews, and saw their own story not as replacing the biblical Israel, but rather as reflecting it. This can be seen first in a wonderful letter that George Washington wrote to the Jews of Savannah, Georgia. When George Washington became president, all the Baptists in America got together and sent him one letter. All the Catholics got together, sent him one letter. All the Quakers got together and sent him one letter. The Jews couldn't decide who gets to send the letter, so they sent him 3 letters. That's the anti-Semitic portion of my speech. Yeah. So the one to Newport is well known, bigotry, no sanction, etc. But perhaps more interesting is his letter to the Jews of Savannah, which concludes with the words, "May the same wonder-working deity who long since delivering the Hebrews from their Egyptian oppressors planted them in the promised land, whose providential agency has lately been conspicuous in establishing these United States as an independent nation, still continue to water them with the dews of heaven and to make the inhabitants of every denomination participate in the temporal and spiritual blessings of that people whose God is," and then he uses God's ineffable name, which he pronounced, but I cannot, referring to the biblical God and to Israel's story as then being reflected in the story of America. Perhaps the person who put it best after Washington was Lincoln, who famously referred to America as an almost chosen nation, saying that "I am exceedingly anxious that this Union and the Constitution be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made, and I shall be most happy if I shall be a humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty and of this, his almost chosen people, for perpetuating the object of that great struggle." The phrase "almost chosen" is, I think, perfect. America is not biblical Israel's replacement, but it is its imitator. Learning the lessons of Israel's biblical story, knowing that like Israel, it is always under God's judgment, but also knowing that unlike biblical Israel, whose eternity is guaranteed, America's endurance depends on its loyalties to the ideas for which the Union was founded. This aspect of Hebraic American exceptionalism achieves its finest moment in Lincoln's second inaugural. And if you read it, you cannot help but wonder at the fact that on the brink of victory in civil war, he engages not in militant triumphalism, and with facing 500,000 dead, Lincoln does not blame scapegoats for this disaster, as Europe might have plied its problems on the Jews for so many centuries. He does not make an idol out of the nation state, but does not deny American exceptionalism. Instead, he calls the country to repentance, sees in the war punishment for the sin of slavery, and proclaims that the judgments of the Lord are righteous altogether. As Paul Johnson points out, it's impossible to imagine Lincoln's European contemporaries, Napoleon III, Bismarck, Gambetta, Thiers, Garibaldi, Cavour, Marx, or Disraeli, thinking in these terms. And so if Jews found a remarkable home in America, it is because America from its beginning found the Jews a remarkable people. And if America became ultimately Israel's best friend, it is because it saw therein a parallel to its own story. Thus, America today supports Zionism, not first and foremost because of its Jews, though in part because of its Jews, but not first and foremost because of its Jews, but rather, a great percentage of whom are secular, but rather because of its tens of millions of Christians who lose sleep when the state of Israel is endangered. Thus, the phrase almost chosen nation at an event in which we reflect on the darkness that is coming over Europe is also a cautionary warning to ourselves. It is a warning to us not to let nationalism, which can be positive, turn into an idolization of the state. But it is also a warning to us about what can happen to a country when we lose connection with a covenant and when we lose a notion about what makes America exceptional. Thus, at the 2012 Democratic Convention, when those in charge attempted to place into the platform both a mention of God and a mention of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the crowd booed. They booed God and Jerusalem and apple pie. No, they didn't do that. Just God and Jerusalem. And all this is a warning to us because America is not chosen. It is almost chosen. It can lose its exceptional nature. And it can also cease to be what it has always been. And it can transform into what Europe was once, or it can transform, as seems very possible, unfortunately, into what Europe has now become. The 7-year-old survivor with which we began, Israel Meir Lau, was placed by Rabbi Schachter with other children of Buchenwald on a transport to France, and from then on to Palestine. He would always remember Rabbi Schachter, but had no idea who it was who had fallen on him at the moment of liberation, protecting him from the shooting, who had shielded this Jewish child right before he met the Yiddish-speaking chaplain. Lau made his way to Palestine, went to yeshiva, entered the rabbinate, and the first major position for which he interviewed was chief rabbi of Netanya. Interviewing for the job with city officials, he encountered hours of questions from the mayor of Netanya and his staff. The deputy mayor of Netanya, a man by the name of David Anilevich, who ought to have been involved in the interview, sat on the side and oddly said nothing. As the interview came to a close, he stood up and said, "Friends, honored rabbis, before we disperse, please let me say my piece. In a minute you will understand why I have remained silent this whole time. I have been reliving 11 April 1945. I was deported from my hometown to Buchenwald, and on April 11th, American airplanes circled the skies above the camps. We ran out of the barracks. A hail of bullets passed us. Among those running toward the gate was a little boy. I realized that any child at Buchenwald had to be Jewish, and I jumped on top of him, threw him to the ground, and lay over him to protect him from the bullets. And today," he said, "I see him before me alive and well. Now," he said, "I declare this to all of you. I, David Anilevich, was saved from that horror, fought for Israel, and today serve as deputy mayor of an Israeli city." Anilevich then banged on the table so that all the glasses shook, and he said, "If I have the merit of seeing this child before me, whom I protected with my body, become my spiritual leader, then I say to you that there is a God." The definition of a miracle for us is an event that should not naturally have occurred. For us, this tends to mean the splitting of the sea, the stopping of the sun, the opening of the earth. But there are miracles around us. It is a miracle that after a generation in which many Jewish children grew up without parents, let alone grandparents, we have experienced the fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy that grandparents will watch their grandchildren play in the streets of Jerusalem. It is a miracle that after so many civilizations have disappeared, Jewish children continue to be born. And it is a miracle that after the bloodiest century known to man, and after anti-Semitism continues to this day to haunt the lands that produced that century, Judaism continues and Jewish children continue as Europe demographically dies. The state of every society can be found in its ability to recognize or to ignore or attack miracles such as these. God, in the beginning of our miraculous story, informed Abraham that I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and through you shall all the nations of the world be blessed. Speaking as a Jew, I am grateful for the blessing of not only Jews, but of so many Christians in America who understand and cherish this verse. And this evening, and the organizations that have put it together and the schools that have put it together, are a testament to that extraordinary fact. May God bless you all, and may He bestow upon all of us many miracles yet to come. Thank you.